It's been a hot minute. Sorry for the long ass wait, but welcome to part 2. If you're wondering why I even bothered with this video, it was meant to be paired with some builds, but then the new building systems came out and this video was just starting to get too long, so I decided to cut it into 2 parts. Part 3, I promise, will be coming out shortly. In case you missed out on part 1, I took a look at some creators who raided their bases fairly lazily, or who outplayed their audience and gave us all some easy raid targets during the wipe. Because sadly, if you inflate the cost of your flawed design, it's gonna do better than honest creators will. I should have mentioned this in part 1, but Rust-based building all depends heavily upon the server you play on. E.g. a main server plays out very differently to a group size restricted, medium/long, or dare I say modded server. My experience comes mainly from Rust Fight.AE main, one of the largest servers in all of Rust. It averages at least around 200 players for the first half of the wipe, and you can really see anything on here from solo, duos and trios up to the rare time we ran a 30-man Zerg. My point is, the Rust experience differs vastly, depending on how you play, how many you play with, and which server you play on. One of the biggest differences between main servers and low pop servers comes during an online raid. In my opinion, on a main server, every raid is in some capacity an online raid due to the high amount of players on at all times. Even if the base owners are offline, there are bound to be counter raiders once you start using explosives, and there's always someone who advertises E12 Zerg rocket raiding. See, often main servers completely invert expectations. For example, small bases often last longer than large bases, because they're not seen as threats or competition, and it's assumed they hold less loot, which in a lot of circumstances isn't the case, as the 2x2 was the staple of farm bases, often positioned close to node-rich environments or monuments. So, I think it's important to talk about the raiding standards in Rust, and if there really is a consistent standard across the board, or if certain styles of raiding only really apply to niche scenarios. Rockets have been the staple of raiding in Rust for as long as I can remember, and it's always been for one good reason: splash damage is speed and power. If you're somehow unaware of how overpowered splash damage is in the current meta, then let me give you a quick rundown. If we take a look at some of the most common floor plans, you'll see indicated by the arrows where you can use splash damage to get into 2 main loot rooms for the price of 1, and in cases where the base has a second floor, potentially 3 or 4 loot rooms for the price of 1. Splash damage extends about a 2x2 range for its primary source of damage, but it also deals reduced damage 1 tile to the left, right, above and below, however not diagonally. As shown on this flat 4x4 wall, you can see that when the amount of rockets is used to destroy the middle section, 4 for stone, 8 for metal, and 15 for armored, the outer 8 walls are dealt around a quarter of their total health and damage, which did vary depending on where the rocket hit. It appears that destroying a wall this way would require around 15 rockets for stone, around 30 for metal, and around 60 for armored. This means when shooting an armored layer surrounded by stone, as shown, the rocket would be very close to, if not, it would have completely destroyed the stone layer. When the armored 2x2 was surrounded by metal and pummeled with 15 rockets, the metal layer was reduced to around half its original health. And when a metal 2x2 was surrounded by stone and pummeled with 8 rockets, the stone layer was left also at just below half of its original health. Now you can aim this splash damage spread, for example, slightly up to destroy the stone layer with the metal layer and effectively get into the honeycomb and see a shooting floor, or as Vice so kindly points out in his raiding video, you can aim this spread to deal close to equal damage across 6 walls. Now, not all bases have perfectly flat walls, so on the 4x4 wall pushed out, it hits all 8 outer tiles, but on the 4x4 wall pulled in, it only hits the top and bottom 4 tiles, dealing no damage to the sides. So, what practical power does this secondary splash damage have? Well, perhaps the worst offender when it comes to dealing with splash damage is this classic circle base floor plan. If you shoot, say, the roof of a stone circle base and continuously replace the 6 inner triangles after 4 rockets to continue the splash damage spread, you can get into all 6 loot rooms for double the price of 1 floor. Or, if you raid a circle base through one of its sides, and then only need to get into the 5 other loot rooms, you can send around 3 rockets into the center of the ceiling floors, or foundations, and for little more than the price of 1 door, get into all loot rooms. This cost is around 5 to 6 for garage doors, 8 for armored, and around 8 to 9 for reinforced windows. This raiding technique works very well against the oval floor plan, the small circle based floor plan, and to some degree on the square floor plan. Door frames come along and really fuck with the consistency of the splash damage spread. See, if you shoot directly from above, say you've broken through the roof and are able to place a floor frame, then you can apply the same principle before. Shooting rockets in the direct center of all these door frames destroys all exterior deployables on both the second and bottom floor. That's 3 rockets for sheet metal doors, 6 for garage, and 8 for armored and reinforced. Surprisingly though, none of the inner doors took even a slither of damage. And the problem really shines when you can't hit this precise center. At that point, the spread becomes incredibly inconsistent, just kinda hitting some parts and completely missing others. Splash damage can work in some mysterious ways. I was unaware for the longest time that splash damage had the ability to destroy these double stacked windows with just 4 rockets. Splash damage is incredibly powerful when used correctly, but the problem is that not every design is vulnerable to rocket raids, and there are ways around these techniques such as better roof honeycombing or flaws in between large sections of walls. However, it seems that a lot of builds are centered around exclusively using rockets, even in circumstances where that's rather ineffective. Take the sheet metal door. See, it's a little dishonest to call this 2 rockets, which is the equivalent of 2.8k sulfur, when you can just use either 1 rocket and 8 expo ammo for 1.6k sulfur, or 63 expo ammo for 1575 sulfur, in both cases almost halving the cost to exclusively using rockets. So, let's take a look and see if any other raiding techniques can compete with the rocket raid. Starting from the bottom, with exclusively using expo ammo, then C4, hyper efficient raiding, which is using a combination of rockets and expo ammo, or C4 and expo ammo on a single tile to minimize the sulfur cost, and finally using jackhammers or other tools to pick through a tile. First, let's touch on combination raiding. While this is an obvious technique, it seems that a majority of builds, whether it's for the sake of simplicity, only really represent their raid costs using rockets. I think it goes without saying that rockets are only really efficient when using splash damage. If we take a look at a few scenarios where splash damage isn't used, you're generally better off using C4 or expo ammo in terms of sulfur cost. I guess the biggest reason for exclusively using rockets in raids is that you don't exactly have a map of the base to plan when you're going to use C4, expo ammo, or rockets, and it is generally more time efficient to just keep pummeling a base with rockets rather than switching to say SR just to raid some areas of the base. The issue with exclusively using rockets in a raid is that it's difficult to obtain large quantities of pipes, e.g. 40 rocket raids require 80 pipes plus more for launches. Pipes are used pretty often in early stages of the wipe, crafting DBs, revolvers, pythons and P2s, which meant from experience 30 to 40 rocket raids may only return 20 to 40 pipes, so you'd be left with a fraction of your original pipe cost, which meant saving them, for example by using expo ammo or C4 on single, non-splash damageable doors or reinforced windows, was the preferred alternative, as spreading out the component cost of tech trash, pipes or gun parts made raids far less expensive. And this is the problem I have with the raiding debate. It seems that time efficiency and component costs are 2 factors that are often ignored. I think there's a careful balance you can find by using small amounts of expo ammo on some deployables, as it does provide an overall lower sulfur and component cost in a fairly time efficient manner. However, this certainly isn't the case for the first circumstantial argument of hyper efficient raiding. While this method is generally more cost effective in terms of its sulfur cost, there are certain tiles where this cost difference is very minimal, if at all. The first big problem with this technique is that it's quite inefficient, requiring, in my opinion, a pretty quiet offline setup to actually be taken advantage of. For example, you wouldn't see a group shoot 3 rockets into a set of stone walls, then line up their 35 expo ammo shots during an online raid, or on a high pop server when they're expecting to encounter roamers or counter raiders. This method isn't exactly practical or time efficient, and it adds a large amount of risk, especially considering Rust's current fast-paced meta. I mean, high tier loot is easy to get, vehicles allow any group of counter raiders to get back into the action quicker or arrive at ongoing raids faster than ever before, and with the addition of the Rust Plus app, countering offline raids, especially on weekend peaks of a main server, are going to be more common than ever before. The second problem is that hyper efficient raiding overuses expo ammo. While using Expo ammo as a secondary raiding tool on some deployables doesn't amount to a very high component cost, after the big Expo ammo nerf, you can't start to use it on walls and every deployable to reduce the overall sofa cost, as it does drastically increase the component cost of a raid. To put it in perspective, here are the stats for the 4 most viable weapons in Expo ammo raids. Every weapon except for the SAR has an incredibly high HQ and repair cost, or requires expensive components or scrap to craft multiple weapons, with the only real or cost effective use of Expo ammo being the M249 or the 10th repair for the SAR. For context, a SAR can destroy 2 sheet metal doors before needing repairs, and the LR or AK can destroy 1 reinforced window before requiring repairs, whereas an M249 can destroy about 10.5 sheet metal doors, 4.4 garage doors, or 3.3 reinforced windows. Point being, Expo ammo can't just be used as freely as it once was, and not every group could get their hands on an M249, and the SAR is incredibly inefficient, only holding 16 shots at a time. Thus, using Expo ammo with hyper efficient raiding, when you're most likely already using it to raid deployables, racks up the component cost quickly, especially if the base you're raiding uses a lot of non-splash damageable garage door corridors. This is why I think it isn't exactly fair to argue that this reduces the overall raid cost of a base, when this method only really works in some quiet offline scenarios or on low pop servers. Another situational raiding tactic that you'll see thrown around a lot is that of soft side raiding, or rather raiding with melee items or tools to reduce, or in some cases entirely remove, the silver cost of going through a certain section of the base. While I do think it's fair to argue that groups could remove the silver cost by picking through the soft side of stone or even a metal layer, where I draw the line is soft side picking through an armored layer, and let me explain why. If you're somehow unaware of where the soft side is, it's on the back side of all wall tiles, top of foundations, bottom of ceilings, all sides on stairs, and nowhere on frames or roofs. If you don't know, jackhammer raiding on an armored layer is when you use around 5 jackhammers to pick through the soft side of a tile. Normally, the stability bunk is high foundation. According to Rust Labs, this takes around 26 minutes or so, and if you use 5 people jackhammering that foundation all at one time, it comes down to around 5 minutes or so, taking into account other variables, which is why it's seen as such a viable tactic. Now the reason it's 5 jackhammers is that you can use a workbench to refill the jackhammer, essentially repairing it without paying a cost. Each jackhammer can be repaired a total of 81 times, however a jackhammer, as you see on this graph, is only really effective for the first 40 repairs, dealing in total 404 damage to an armored layer. To put that in perspective, one C4 deals 275 damage, one rocket deals 138, and one explosive ammo deals around 2 damage to a building block tile. The last 41 repairs only deal an extra 59 damage, making those repairs rather pointless, as 5 jackhammers being repaired 40 times each still is able to pick through the soft side of an armored layer. The problem is that a lot of bases utilize external TCs and or hide their main TC in the very stability bunker that you're trying to raid into, meaning that now you've loudly announced the raid to the whole server, you can't even seal off the breach, which drastically increases the risk of counter raiders or roamers, especially on high pop servers. From my experience, I wouldn't want to sit around for 6 minutes plus while there's a big exposed hole in the base jackhammering away when I can say with some certainty that I'll be encountering roamers, counter raiders, or the very people I'm onlining. Keep in mind that you'll be holding your best kits, all the raiding resources you've just grinded for, and any loot you may have already obtained. The thing about jackhammer raiding is that it requires a workbench. If you don't know, using a repair bench doesn't work. It only gives the jackhammer a total of 20 repairs, dealing in total 115 damage per jackhammer, and it also costs 20 HQM plus 600 frags to fully repair this jackhammer all 20 times. In total, this method would see you using around 16 jackhammers, which is a total of 320 HQM plus 9.6k frags. If that's not already obvious, that's just unaffordable and a waste of resources. With this in mind, you could place your workbench inside the bunker section of your base, as this would mean that raiders would have to place their own raid base with a workbench outside of your external TC area, and then run there and back through the breach a total of 40 times per each one of the 5 jackhammers, which in my opinion, if you don't have that base sealed, makes jackhammer raiding far too risky. Jackhammer raiding in the bunker-based meta means that almost all stability bunkers are vulnerable, since most rely on high foundations, with a couple of exceptions. The only real way to prevent jackhammer raids is to add half walls and floors to honeycomb those foundations, but this is incredibly expensive if your stability bunker is HQM, as is the case here, where it adds an additional 164 HQM to the cost. So I would say consider the server you play on. If it's high pop, then I personally don't worry about jackhammer raids because it's far too risky to spend that much time jackhammering away when you're most definitely going to encounter roamers or counter raiders. But perhaps if it's a lower pop server, the alternative, I would argue, is to just honeycomb those foundations with metal half walls and floors, as it provides a cost-effective equivalent raid cost of 8 rockets and 5 jackhammers. The other big issue with jackhammer raids is the opportunity cost. What I mean by this, in a single base, there are many areas one could argue that they could pick through the soft side of a certain tile. For example, there may be 2 stability bunkers, certain parts of the honeycomb, or perhaps a floor or window backside wall to pick through. At what point do you draw the line and say just because you can use the situational raiding tactic means that this part of the base across the board no longer should be considered in the raid cost? Jackhammer raiding and armored layer, for example, requires 5 people for maximum efficiency, plus I'd say 1 or 2 for defense, and an additional 750 scrap or luck to obtain 5 full health jackhammers. My point being, I don't think it's fair to argue that every soft side can be picked into, because the time it would take to not only acquire all those jackhammers, but to use them to raid multiple soft sides, would make that tactic incredibly unreasonable and quite unrealistic, unless you're in some quite offline scenario. Even then, this tactic doesn't really apply to all group sizes, as having a solo to trio jackhammer raiding would probably take longer than gathering the resources for rockets or C4. So what is Rust's raiding standard? Well, I think the circumstantial arguments are just that, circumstantial. They may work in some quiet offline scenarios, but I don't think everyone should go and adjust their raid costs based on these 2 very niche raiding tactics that don't really hold much power in a typical main server, especially considering a base you haven't seen before, where you can't exactly plan when you're going to use jackhammers or how much exp ammo to prepare. I do think that using small amounts of exp ammo or C4 instead of rockets in scenarios where rockets don't utilize splash damage is a better way to represent the raid cost, because it generally doesn't go above 700 exp ammo per raid. But I know that a lot of builds will like to keep it simple and just have a rocket cost on their thumbnail, which I think is fair enough when you're just raiding to say TC in a main loot room, but if you're going to claim that your entire base is worth say 30 rockets, then I think you should be switching out for cheaper alternatives when rockets aren't being used effectively. Well, that's my 2 cents on the raiding standards in Rust. If you got any value out of this discussion, then I'd appreciate any support, and I'm more than happy to discuss any of the arguments I've made in the comments. Anyways, thanks for sticking around and showing a lot of support for part 1. It was pretty insane. Sorry it took so goddamn long. I got some more interesting content planned that I hope to get out on a more regular basis. And I swear it's none of that cookie cutter basic bitch shit. I'll try and make up for my absence with some cool designs in part 3. For now though, I'll catch you in the next one.